Good afternoon. I'm Mike Perry. I'm the Executive Director of the Army Heritage Center Foundation, and we are pleased that you joined today's program. Today, Brian McAllister Linn, a professor of history and director of the Military Studies Institute at Texas A&M University, is our spokesperson. Brian has taught at A&M since 1989. He received his BA from the University of Hawaii Manoa campus and his MA and PhD from Ohio State University. A student of American military history, he is best known for his works on the U.S. military involvement in Asia in the first half of the 20th century. He is the author of the U.S. Army and Counterinsurgency in the Philippine War, 1899 to 1902, and Guardians of Empire, the U.S. Army and the Pacific, 1902 to 1940, and the Filipino War, 1899 to 1902. His books have won several prizes and several have been selected for the History Book Club. Today he's going to talk about his most recent book, Elvis's Army, Cold War GIs and the American Battlefield. Brian, the floor is now yours.
Good afternoon. Mike forgot to mention that I was also the former Harold K. Johnson Professor of Military History at the Army War College. And today I'm going to be talking about the 1950s U.S. Army's efforts to develop the organization, doctrine, technologies, and personnel to wage atomic warfare. This effort began after World War II, it accelerated during the Korean War, and it was almost ended by the time of the Vietnam conflict. This transformation initiative has been largely forgotten within the United States Army. In the current Army ROTC military history textbook, there are some 500 pages devoted to the period from 1917 to 2003, but barely 5 or slightly under 1% discuss the 1950s Army's efforts to prepare for nuclear warfare. I hope by the end of this webinar, you'll be convinced, as I am, that the atomic era deserves far more attention. Not only is it a very fascinating period of the United States Army's past, but I think it's got much to teach us about both current and future military issues. Have the next slide, please. Now, military history has always had as its one of its objectives to provide a usable past for soldiers. From Thucydides to the present, officers read and have written history to better understand the military realities they face now or they think they will face soon. For that reason, at several points in my talk, I'm going to make some comparisons between the United States Army's current efforts at creating a future force and that of the post-World War II Atomic Army. This Army Vision 2018 statement provides the clearest explanation to date of the United States Army's leadership view of the service's future for the next decade. It's a very ambitious vision of a distinct mode of warfare, multi-domain operations, whose successful implementation is dependent, as you can see by the highlighted areas, on the Army's ability to reform 4 key determinants: equipment, organization, doctrine, and personnel. Well, the obvious question is, how does the Army get there from here? I mean, the vision begins with the declarative statement that today's Army is the most lethal and capable combat force in history. That is about as high a standard as any military organization can boast. But the vision also states that standard is not enough. The Army must be much, much better by 2028. It has to create new equipment and supporting equipment, some of which is still theoretical. Some is on the drawing boards, some is in prototype. It has to create new organizations to replace those it recently used in Iraq and Afghanistan. It needs to create a new doctrine. It needs to keep or recruit, keep new personnel. In other words, this is a total transformation, a radical, even revolutionary break with today's Army to create the Army of the future. Now, if this decade of revolution is to happen, then I would argue it's incumbent on the United States Army and those who support it to study history for similar examples of radical transformations. Other eras when the Army sought to implement a radically new vision of war. Other periods when it simultaneously had to develop new doctrines, new organizations, new equipment, and new personnel. And I would argue, and I am going to argue today, that if today's Army wants such historic examples, there's no better place to start than its own experience as the Atomic Army. Have the next slide, please. Now, historians are always insisting that the past be put into its proper context. These, can you move the slide up a bit, please? These two quotations serve to illustrate a crucial difference between Atomic Army and the present military consciousness. Americans have lived with the nuclear threat for over 70 years, and it's one of the existential threats we face now, one of many existential threats from cyber to COVID-19. And since the Vietnam War, the American public and the United States Army have placed their faith for the nation's land warfare commitments in a small, all-volunteer elite force armed with the most advanced weaponry. And for almost as long, the United States Army's concept of war may be said to revolve around such ideas as full spectrum dominance and rapid decisive operations. And as part of this concept of war, for many years, the United States Army has taken its historic interpretations from the great campaigns of World War II. For example, in the most recent Army Chief of Staff's reading list, of the 27 books listed under history and military history, over half cover either World War II in total or partial, and almost 1/3 deal entirely with World War II or its origins. In fact, the Chief of Staff's list suggests that a, if not the, primary case study for today's US Army are the German Blitzkrieg campaigns, perhaps an example of an elitist, combined arms, shock and awe military organization waging rapid, decisive, mobile operations. But it's important to recognize that the lessons that today's Army draws from World War II are not necessarily the same lessons of the veterans of that war. They had beaten the German Army. For them, Blitzkrieg is not a problem that needs to be immediately resolved. To those who set the course of the Army in the decade after 1945, the one lesson that they drew was the sheer destruction of modern warfare. They had witnessed at firsthand the hollowed, burned out shells of formerly great cities from Munich to Manila. 80,000 civilians were killed in one night of bombing in Tokyo. Now that is a level of lethality and capability that's pretty hard to match, even by the standards of today's Army. And in 1947, when they should have been celebrating their victory, the American Army's leadership was facing the prospect of an even more devastating war with the Soviet Union, a war that would be waged against an enemy so ruthless and with weapons so terrible, it would be even more costly in lives, resources, and human suffering than that they had recently fought against the Axis. The second significant lesson that American Army leaders drew from their experiences in World War II was that destruction was only a means to an end. Their fixation on military lethality and capability had been one of the great weaknesses of the German and Japanese armed forces. They'd conquered, they'd killed, they'd destroyed, almost at an unprecedented level. And yet soon after their great lightning campaigns, they'd been completely defeated. And now it was the United States Army's mission to occupy and restore its former enemies. Those who had served in the Army's leadership would have been both amused and appalled at the pre-Iraq belief that US war objectives would be restricted to destroying the armed forces of a centralized nation state, and thus the United States Armed Forces could be configured only for that eventuality. For many, in fact, the great lesson of the post-World War II era was that the Army's mission was not only to win campaigns, but to further the nation's security by establishing peace, stability, and order. And I think it's very vital to understand that perspective in that post-World War II leadership, to appreciate in a way why it committed itself to atomic war. This is in part a story of a deeply concerned, highly intelligent, truly innovative military leadership who sought to create an army that would be victorious in war against the Soviet Union and yet not plunge the nation into a nuclear holocaust. Can I have the next slide, please? I think it's also important to recognize that the generation of young people who served in that 1950s Army also had a very different view of World War II. These were not people who grew up playing Call of Duty or watching Band of Brothers. Their experience was far more immediate. And most Americans now have that Call of Duty, Band of Brothers perspective and a pretty romantic view of World War II. But to the generation that came into the Army in the 1950s, they had very little illusions about war. They were surrounded by veterans of that conflict. And this quotation, and keep in mind, this is only 10 years after the end of the war, and that the speaker is about to be commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Army. It's worth thinking about. He's going into uniform, but he's doing it with a very practical idea of what soldiers do and what combat is like. He has no wish to charge into battle. And perhaps it's worth wondering if the people who grow up today are going to have a similarly cynical view when they're called upon to go into the service. Next slide, please. Now, historians are always going on about context, but I think we really have to understand that to understand the atomic army. The Army's efforts to create this sort of new model force had to overcome tremendous political and popular resistance. For many Americans in the post-World War II era, including President Truman and most of Congress, the atomic bomb appeared to be the ultimate weapon. Truman believed that atomic weapons provided the United States with an insurmountable advantage in the growing Cold War with the Soviet Union. And he shared with Congress a great concern about a return to the Great Depression, and thus was determined to cut military budgets. Both overconfidence in the atomic deterrent and financial incentives led Truman and war planners to focus on waging general war. That's all-out nuclear war. War would begin, probably end, with all the American strategic nuclear forces delivering atomic bombs on Soviet cities. Now, the post-World War II Army was the primary target of this military cost cutting. It lost not only personnel, but funding for equipment, facilities, and administration. Its tactical formations were hollowed out. Realistic training was almost non-existent. It was given the dregs of the manpower pool. And the result of this personnel and financial starvation were apparent in June 1950, when the North Korean Army pushed aside American forces, almost destroyed the 24th Infantry Division, and forced American, Korean, and Allied troops into the Pusan perimeter. Now, the Korean War led to a massive increase in the United States Army, almost tripling its manpower and its personnel, and its budgets. But it also left very large post-war commitments, most notably 250,000 troops permanently stationed in Europe as part of the NATO Defense Force. And in fact, even during the Korean War, the United States Army attention had shifted to defending Europe. And that would be the primary interest of the Army and a major incentive for driving Army doctrine and organization, really up until the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. Now, following the Korean War armistice, President Eisenhower's new look and his misnamed strategy of massive retaliation with strategic nuclear weapons left the Army with very little mission, except perhaps to act as a tripwire in Asia and Europe. And so under Eisenhower, the Army again suffered a huge drawdown that in 6 years almost cut its personnel in half. And its equipment budgets and so forth were also cut as well. Eisenhower's policies, again, were supported by the American public and by Congress. So to the American public in the 1950s, the symbol of their defense establishment was the B-52 bomber. And the Army was seen, much as it had been in World War II in Korea, as primitive, brutal, dirty, and dangerous, a military establishment that fought the wars of the past, not the wars of the present or the future. Now, the Army's response to general war and to mass retaliation was on many levels. Apologize for the mosquito treatment, but there it is. Successive Army chiefs of staff argued that a national military strategy based entirely on the threat of nuclear annihilation was both morally and strategically bankrupt. It was little more than a recipe for national suicide. As General Collins has stated in 1947, for the Army, the purpose of the nation's armed forces was not mere lethality and destruction. It was to achieve national objectives such as peace and stability and security. The Army chiefs of staff and other Army intellectuals argued that atomic weapons should only be used if and when they would accomplish these national goals, not simply to obliterate Russia's economy and cities and populations. The Army also noted the increasing size and effectiveness of both Soviet and American nuclear arsenals and postulated increasingly that massive retaliation was no longer viable. Indeed, as the Soviets grew stronger, massive retaliation was encouraging the Soviets to launch a preemptive nuclear strike before the Americans became even stronger. Finally, American Army officers also pointed out the contradiction between the United States' claims that the Russian people were enslaved under communist tyranny and a military strategy that targeted those civilians. In the words of one Army War College student, and I quote, "To use nuclear weapons indiscriminately is to repeat past blunders. The way in which they are used will determine whether the millions of enslaved people are to be our allies or the unwilling defenders of Moscow. They seek liberation, not obliteration." Now, these are all valid arguments, but they are all arguments against mass retaliation and against strategic nuclear warfare. They didn't provide a solution to the Soviet threat. Thus, for its own survival, and in their view, the nation's survival, the Army had to find how to use the atomic bomb to fight a limited war without escalating into an all-out nuclear war. Next slide, please. Although there's many Army officers who contributed to developing this service vision of warfare, Lieutenant General James M. Gavin stands at their head. Of course, Gavin's one of the most famous officers of the 20th century Army, but that's largely because of his role as commanding general of the 82nd Airborne in World War II. What the Army seldom recognizes is his post-war contribution, his brilliance, his creativity, and his determination to improve the Army that he so loved. In a pioneering book, 1947's Airborne Warfare, Gavin concluded that many of the organizations and technologies and doctrines that had made the Army so successful just 2 years earlier were no longer viable. In particular, he recognized that the huge concentrations of personnel and supplies, those clogged logistic depots, the mass attacks that had been effective in France in 1944, would be immediately targeted by atomic weapons. Again, next slide, please. Gavin envisioned a future battlefield that may seem familiar to many of you. In fact, it's probably the battlefield in some ways without the atomic weapons that you may have grown up with. And perhaps because of that, it's hard to appreciate what a radical break those were with the Army's recently successful methods of World War II. Gavin was especially critical of what he viewed as Army generals' tendency to, quote, slug it out, relying on their superior firepower and their superior resources to wear down their enemies in battles of attrition. He was appalled at what he viewed as wasteful and unnecessary operations such as the Hurricane Forest. And he also believed that atomic weapons would prevent such bloodshed. In an article entitled "The Tactical Use of the Atomic Bomb," Gavin cited Operation Cobra, the Normandy breakout, and argued that 2 atomic bombs could have done what it required 8,000 artillery shells and 3,000 airplanes to accomplish. Now, he recognized that atomic weapons were a two-edged sword. If the United States was going to employ them effectively and not escalate into a thermonuclear exchange with the Soviets, the Army needed to revolutionize its tactics and its organization. And so in this vision of future war, you see scattered units occupying vast frontages, maneuvering against Soviet massed combat forces, strong points, and supply areas, striking them with atomic weapons, concentrating to mop up, and then dispersing to do this again. The next slide, please. Now, that vision of war was confirmed by the experience of the Korean War. In that conflict, as you remember, the American Army found its superiority in equipment and firepower matched by North Korean and Chinese manpower and the communist willingness to sustain casualties. So instead of this rapid, decisive war of movement that the United States Army's doctrine favored and its equipment was designed for, it became bogged down in a costly, unpopular, and indecisive war of attrition. Some officers, including Gavin, favored breaking the stalemate with atomic weapons, but other military, and perhaps more importantly, political leaders, rejected that option. But even as the Korean War is being fought, the Army is developing a mantra: no more Koreas. They had to find another solution than attrition, and as this shows, tactical atomic weapons appeared to provide that solution. Can I have the next slide? A further incentive to the US Army's interest in atomic weapons was what we call the worst case scenario, the Soviet invasion of Western Europe. Throughout the 1950s, as this slide from an Army TV show demonstrates, the Red Army numbered about 2,500,000. It also had thousands of tanks, artillery, vehicles, and even after the Korean War buildup, the United States forces in Europe were barely 10% of that. Given both the disparity of numbers and material and the need to protect Western Europe, so you couldn't fight defense in depth, the Army couldn't fight a Korean-style war of attrition. Now, Army leaders did not believe that the nation's strategic nuclear force was a deterrent to the Soviet invasion of Western Europe. In their view, both Truman's faith in the ultimate weapon and Eisenhower's massive retaliation were a bluff. They were convinced American presidents would never unleash the nation's nuclear arsenal if the consequences were the destruction of American cities by Soviet atomics. The Army predicted that very soon the Soviets were going to call that bluff. The Red Army, when the Warsaw Pact allies, would sweep into Western Europe, and the United States would have 3 unacceptable choices. The first was to honor that NATO alliance and launch all-out strategic nuclear war on Russia and suffer the consequent damage to the United States. The second alternative was to use strategic nuclear weapons to try and stop the Red Army's attack. But that would mean bombing NATO, bombing your very own allies, condemning millions of civilians to nuclear holocaust. And the third alternative, perhaps the worst of all, was simply to accept the Red Army's invasion of Western Europe, the Soviet exploitation of the resources and populations of Western Europe, and thus defeat in the Cold War. In place of massive retaliation, the Army argued that it was now possible to fight and win a limited tactical atomic war. In the Army's scenario, the leaders of the United States and the Soviet Union would agree not to target each other's cities or populations with thermonuclear weapons. Instead, they would agree to limit atomics to low kiloton weapons and restrict them to military forces. Now, that still left NATO forces considerably outnumbered by the Soviet bloc. And since the American public would not support a buildup to match Soviet personnel and equipment, the only solution was for the United States Army to develop sufficient mobility to avoid those massed armored spearheads and sufficient firepower to destroy them. Thus, the European limited tactical war scenario supported Gavin's tactics and also the lessons of the Korean War, and back to long-range, highly mobile, dispersed forces that could maneuver and strike, disperse and concentrate. Next slide, please. Now that's the idea, the Army vision, if you will, of the 1950s. What we're going to do now is talk about how that was created. Already talked a little bit about the tactics, and I think that in many ways was the most easy, though it was still a brilliantly innovative idea. But as we know, tactics and doctrine are not enough. What we're now going to look at is technology and organization. Next slide, please. Now, the Army recognized that to fight atomic war, you would have to develop its own atomic doctrine, or its own atomic warhead. Now, if you can, could you move that up just a little bit, please? Yeah, so what you see here is a 1955 estimate by the Army's Combat Developments Group on the projections of what a field army would need to fight limited atomic war. Now, to put it in perspective, the Hiroshima bomb was about 20 kilotons. And you can see that's at the very low end of the Army's atomic wish list. 3/4 of the warheads the Army requires to fight limited atomic war were of much greater destructive capacity. Next slide, please. Now, while the vast number and power of that 1950 estimate must be pretty shocking, you have to recognize it's done in the context of the service's surprise and pride at the rapid development of its atomic arsenal. If you can remember what pictures of Fat Man and Little Boy looked like, and remember that they had to be strapped under the biggest airplane in the world at that time, you'll be impressed too that by 1952, 7 years after Hiroshima, the Army unveiled the M65 280 millimeter cannon that could fire a 20 kiloton shell, roughly equivalent to Hiroshima, over 15 miles with accuracy and speed that surpassed any airplane. Atomic Annie, as she became known, was an Army showplace. It appeared in Eisenhower's inauguration, and it was then dispatched with great public ceremony down into Europe. And by 1955, there were 6 field artillery batteries, a total of 36 atomic cannon in West Germany. People at the time, and when we talked about destruction, were very impressed with the devastation that Atomic Annie could deliver. In fact, one newspaper correspondent claimed that if these 36 cannon in Europe were lined up 1 mile apart and fired in an hour, they would have expended the destructive equivalent of all artillery from the invention of gunpowder to the end of the Napoleonic Wars. If they were fired for a second hour, they would have surpassed the destruction of all artillery combined up to now, including World War I. And by the third hour, they would have surpassed all the guns and aircraft of World War II. That's pretty impressive. However, in practice, Atomic Annie proved to be a flawed weapon. It was so big, it couldn't be really transported over German roads or under German bridges, and it had to be deployed up on mountains where it was so unstable that it often tipped over, earning the name among its crews of the Widowmaker. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, The 280 millimeter cannon is an evolutionary step in a 500-year-old weapon. But to many Army progressives, it was missiles that were the future. Missiles appeared to be ideal delivery systems for tactical atomic weapon or tactical atomic warfare. They had more mobility, they had more range and firepower, and they were far less dependent on vulnerable depots and logistic lines. Planners envisioned them striking as far as 1,500 miles into the Soviet Union, what later generations would call the deep battle, thus disrupting Red Army mobilization and the follow-up echelons deep into Eastern Europe. An arsenal of immediate and close-range missiles would then shatter enemy forces with the initial attack as they moved forward. By the mid-1950s, the United States missile arsenal included the Corporal, which is a guided liquid fuel rocket with a range of about 65 miles, and the Honest John, a free or unguided 762 millimeter rocket with a range that began at 15 miles and later grew. To these would later be added the Little John, which was an air transportable 320 millimeter air free rocket with a range that eventually reached 20 miles. Next slide, please. Now, the Army's vision of a small, mobile, dispersed, wide-ranging battle group carrying portable, close-range atomic firepower reached its pinnacle in 1960 with the Davy Crockett. This weapon could be mounted on a Jeep or an armored personnel carrier, and it could be even transported by helicopter. Its small crew could hurl the equivalent of 10 to 20 tons of TNT between 2 and 4 kilometers. Theoretically, teams with Davy Crockett's could travel undetected, move quickly into ambush, blast their opponents, and then speed off to wreak similar havoc a few miles later. Theoretically, in fact, a few squads could destroy an entire Soviet armored division, thus resolving this problem of how vastly outnumbered US forces could repel this Russian steamroller. Can I say next slide, please? Now, I think what's important to recognize is these missiles, tactical atomic weapons, and other marvels that appeared so quickly after World War II were seen only as the beginning of the transformed Army of the future. These slides are from a presentation at the Army War College by the CGSC on Army 80. So where the Army would be in the late 1970s. And the Army extrapolated from these breakthroughs to a future war that was truly impressive. Like Multi-Domain Battle 2028, Multi-Domain Operations 2028, Army planners envision in the next decade and a half a host of new technologies that would allow for these dispersion, concentration, dispersion tactics. Next slide, please. This picture from the same lecture illustrates how these new technologies would be used on the atomic battlefield of the future. As you can see, these brand new super weapons are maneuvering at very widely dispersed, a wide range of vehicles, small units, in fact, are now pretty well vehicles, and are engaging the enemy first as an enemy tank, but also you can see in the foreground, the background, a large atomic cloud that's being targeted by one of these atomic weapons. Next slide, please. This image from a Army TV show called The Big Picture from 1960 illustrates the Army's vision of what atomic warfare would look like. And this is probably a scene immediately after an atomic strike with the troops landing, concentrating to mop up, and then as soon as they've done so, they will disperse and strike again. Next slide, please. To me, this next illustration is perhaps the most interesting. This is from around the same time. You notice the wide variety of Army weapons and equipment from a single infantryman down in the bottom to Honest John rockets, to self-propelled artillery, to drones. Note the electronic command and control capacity, aerial reconnaissance, communications network, full battle space awareness. Now, why does this seem familiar? Can we look at the next slide, please? Yes. I think we can all see that 1957 vision of future war had enormous impact on later Army concepts. I would submit, in fact, that the great intellectual change that goes on from a World War II mass conscript army to a small, elite, high-tech, highly mobile force of dispersed units waging rapid, decisive operations does not come, as many people believe, from the 1970s active defense and then particularly the 1980s air-land battle. I would submit, in fact, it comes from the 1950s. So the Army wants to know the intellectual origins of its current vision of war. It should go back to the 1950s. Next slide. Now, this doctrine of limited or tactical atomic war and the growing atomic arsenal were two essential parts of the Army's transformation. The third, and I'll just quote from Army Vision 2018, is robust combined arms formations. And this was initiated by Chief of Staff Maxwell D. Taylor in 1956 when he revived his World War II unit, the 101st Airborne Division, as the Army's first atomic age division. Officially known as, and this is a pretty cumbersome title, Reorganization of the Combat Infantry Division, or ROCID, Taylor christened it the Pentomic, a Madison Avenue allusion to its 5 battle groups and its atomic mission. The Pentomic Division was intended to be more flexible, more mobile, more deployable, to fight dispersed and concentrated, and to be equipped with a host of the Army's latest technologies, new tanks, new helicopters, new personnel carriers, and most notably, atomic missiles to replace much of the artillery. Next slide, please. So this is a sort of series of images from the reactivation of the 1956 101st, I believe. And here you can see the note the missiles and all the vehicles that the Pentomic Army required to fight mobile warfare. Next slide, please. Another thing that's worth noting about the Pentomic Army was that there was going to create a new elite, the atomic missileers. And in fact, the Army staff spent quite a bit of time designing a new patch to identify this new elite. Here's a soldier superimposed on a missile in an atomic helix with the 5-star behind them, symbolizing, of course, the Pentomic Army. Next slide, please. And this, I think, from 1960, symbolizes the vision coming together. A new modern American soldier. To anyone who had sort of seen the World War II soldiers, this would have been clearly recognized as a new uniform, a new weapon, a new pack, and so forth. With this brand new technology, the helicopter, and notice the troops are deploying and charging into an atomic cloud. Next slide, please. Now, what we need to talk about is this idea in practice. We've talked about the new organizations, the new doctrines, new equipment, but how did this all play out? Much of the problems with Pentomic Army are the very things that generated it. That is, this belief in new technology would resolve the problems of the future battlefield. Army officers assumed that this technological breakthroughs that they had seen since World War II would continue to accelerate, as that Army 80 illustrates. Now, technology did continue to accelerate, but often new improvements brought new problems. Paul Jussel, an instructor at the Army War College, has shown that with the Pentomic Division, a key problem was communications. Radios did improve from tubes to transistors. They got smaller, lighter, and further range. But that did not mean that they had the capability of allowing commanders to communicate with their increasingly small dispersed units or to coordinate atomic strikes. So the World War II division requires 1,754 radios. By the Korean War, that had increased to 2,400. But a pentomic division, 3 years after Korea, requires 3,000. And as this increased, by the time they were getting rid of it, 3,600 radios. But even those radios and the addition of 600 more tons of radio equipment than World War II division had did not allow sufficient communication. Another problem was the Davy Crockett. For the first time, this Army vision that's outlined with Gavin and so forth of mobile, dispersed, wide-ranging units with tactical atomic weapons becomes a reality. But that means that combat commanders now have to learn and implement the complexities of the nuclear battlefield. In World War II and Korea, and even in many 1950s exercises, Corps and division commanders, most of them had infantry backgrounds, passed off the complicated problems of fire support to their staffs or their brigade artillery officers. But now you have dozens of small infantry groups potentially firing off dozens, if not hundreds, of atomic weapons. And suddenly senior commanders have to coordinate all that firepower and ensure, most seriously, that they don't shoot each other. For their part, the junior battle group commanders now had to learn to use these weapons. They had to go through special warfare school. They had to learn how to compute blast, memorize release protocols, many, many other tasks. And they also had to meet the federal requirements for storage, maintenance, security, and transport, none of which were written for military forces in the field. So despite the promise that pentomic divisions would be lean, mobile, and efficient, they soon had to start attaching more and more support forces, more and more equipment, more and more logistics, and even that ultimately did not help. Next, please. Training for atomic warfare provided a crucial test of Army doctrine, equipment, and organizations. Now, to the Army of the 1950s, what they looked back to were the 1940 maneuvers that had prepared them for World War II. And so they continued to believe that large-scale exercises would allow soldiers and commanders to anticipate the great atomic land war against the Soviet Union. So these exercises focused on combined arms and joint warfare, and they were incredibly costly in training time, resources, and money. Divisions that had to do one of these essentially didn't train for a year, just preparing for this rotation. In 1955, 100,000 CONUS soldiers took part in one of these exercises. Next year, Operation Sagebrush, which is the largest of these, 135,000 Air Force and Army personnel maneuvered over an area the size of Rhode Island. And at a time when a private made less than $80 a month, Sagebrush cost over $20 million. What did these maneuvers reveal? Well, one of the first to use tactical atomic warfare, or what's called atomic play, was Exercise Longhorn, which was held in Texas in April 1952, and had over 115,000 participants. It had the 280 millimeter cannon, nuclear camouflage, protection, and atomic tactics. The scenario was a hypothetical invasion from San Antonio to Dallas, with the 82nd Airborne playing the aggressor force, and 2 infantry divisions and 1 armored division, one of them National Guard, to be the defenders. Now, to senior officers, this exercise, and I quote, proved conclusively that the days of close formation are over when the enemy has an atomic capability, and that dispersion, field fortifications, and mobility would characterize the future battlefield. In other words, Longhorn further validated the Army's tactical warfare doctrine and Gavin's vision of future war. But it also revealed a number of problems that would plague both later atomic exercises. One criticism was this a training exercise for the troops or to practice an atomic warfare scenario? The second problem was that every branch had to be involved. And the Army's most visible branch at this time was the airborne, which thus the airborne always had to make at least one parachute landing. And in many cases, because the Army wanted to publicize the airborne, these became public relations events with gaggles of televisions, movies, press cameras, correspondence, which of course, when they landed, immediately meant that they were the targets of the enemy's atomic strikes. There's also a problem that these airheads quickly would have become targets for atomic strikes as well. And more of the problem was how difficult it was to launch atomic strikes against enemies practicing those mobile dispersed tactics, particularly when communications were so problematic. It often took hours for an atomic strike to be authorized. And by that time, of course, the situation had changed. Because of the long delays, umpires found that commanders were ordering tactical strikes for the most minor of tactical problems. Knowing that it took so long to get authorization for an atomic strike, they would simply order the strike to resolve any problem. The other problem, of course, was movement. Found out that there was huge rains, bridges broke down, roads got clogged, all of which would have allowed the enemy to attack. Increasingly, there was more and more doubts about whether these exercises could either train troops or if they were realistic tests of atomic warfare. And when you look at that criticism of Bright Star, you can see that these things are all being manifest even by 1960. The other thing that was very disturbing was that tactical atomic war wasn't limited. In exercise Carte Blanche in 1956, the Army simulated the effects of 355 nuclear strikes to defend NATO. It assessed that 1,700,000 people were killed in a week and 3,500,000 wounded. And that is without, by the way, radiation and fallout. The exercise was a public relations disaster. And at its end, a poll found that 2 out of 3 West Germans opposed the American use of atomic weapons, even if it meant Soviet occupation. So if these exercises were intended to show the American commitment to NATO, they were not working. Okay, next slide, please. Now, radical changes in doctrine, in equipment, and organization are 3 of the characteristics of military transformation noted in Army Vision 2018. But what about the 4th? Exceptional leaders and soldiers of unmatched lethality. The 1950s Army required 500 separate MOSs. Some of them, such as combat infantrymen, required only a few months. Others might require almost 2 years. The 1950s Army leadership had grown up in the 1930s. And they assumed that any young man, because at this time it was pretty well restricted to men, any young man who entered the service had a variety of skills that they could quickly adapt to military needs. And as you can see from this quote, much of the promise of the Pentomic Division's success was predicated on this reservoir of technical skill coming in from the young. They believed that a typical young man would come in already a proficient automobile mechanic from working on his hot rod, already a skilled communication specialist from building a ham radio, many, many other skills. And these young men would be happy to join the Army of the future. Well, today's Army faces the same challenges that 1950s did. When I was at the War College, all I heard was this great enthusiasm by senior field officers for the wired generation. And I still hear field officers assuring me that the current generation will bring into the service valuable skills that can soon be transferred to military applications. It may be true, But I have to tell you, I've been a university professor for 30 years, and I've been around undergraduates for 10 years more than that. And I have my own perception of American youth. My perception has been that for every new skill a generation picks up, there's a almost equal deterioration in an older skill that would be equally valuable. So senior leaders expect the new people to come in with skills at electronics. They must also accept there's probably a deterioration at something as simple as writing with a pen and pencil, with a pen or pencil. Next slide, please. The 1950s transforming Army learned, perhaps for the first time for a peacetime American Army, a very sad fact. The more sophisticated its equipment became, the more leadership that pentomic tactics demanded of enlisted men, and the more education and technical skills it required for both officers and enlisted. Now the Army, I mean, you have to remember, the generation that's running this, Maxwell Taylor, Ridgway, and so forth, came into the 1920s and 30s Army where the average private had probably less than a 6th grade education. The average NCO had barely an 8th grade education. So that was the Army that they remembered as junior officers. Now, this new Army requires a host of new people, high school graduates. High school graduate in World War II is almost enough to make you an officer. So they wanted to bring these people in, and at the same time, they needed to bring these people in because their equipment becomes more and more complicated. In World War II, the average Jeep driver could probably be taught to do routine maintenance on his Jeep. By 1953, that same driver could not even tune the engine of his Jeep because the carburetor had become so complicated, it required a trained mechanic. Whole classes of skilled labor appear in crucial specialties that hadn't even existed 10 years before. And I'll give you an example. This poster shows a young man in front of a Nike missile with the slogan, "Enlist for Electronics," and it captures the Army's problem. By 1960, the Army required almost 40 separate military occupational specialties in missile control and missile maintenance. To qualify for any of them, a recruit needed a high school degree and strong math scores. Nike technicians had to complete their 16 weeks of advanced and basic training. Then they went to intensely competitive schools with about a 10% monthly dropout. By the time they graduated, this small group, they had gone through, say, a missile batteries electronic maintenance technician, had gone through a 22-week certificate course of almost 1,000 hours of instruction. A fire control maintenance technician had passed a 38-week course of 1,672 hours. If you think about that, you recognize the Army had made an enormous commitment to training this new force in electronics. Next slide, please. Now, today's Army needs, I think, about 60,000 people a year. The 1950s Army needed 250,000 young people, and it went into service every year. They included males of every region, race, religion, education, socioeconomic background. I mean, the Army is the great mixing bowl of the 1950s. And for the Army, this annual influx of new soldiers was both a blessing and a challenge. It allowed them access to far more talent than they could recruit through volunteers. And it also assured that much of that force was transitory in the process of being trained and needed to be socialized, educated, and provided with military skills. The Army also had a social mission at this time. 1950s, there was great concern about juvenile delinquency. Young people had lost their moral compass. They lived on hamburgers, they listened to rock and roll, they didn't play sports. And it was up to the Army to fix this broken generation. Have things changed? Army Times recently reported that 70% of Americans 17 to 25 were ineligible for military service due to criminal records or lack of education or health issues. and only 13%, or barely 1 in 10, could, if they did qualify and were available, would have a satisfactory score on their qualification test. Can I see the next slide, please? Since much of the Army's most essential specialist training took almost a year, a draftee usually had barely a year after finishing training before his obligation was over and he was discharged. One study found that in skilled positions, the Army got more out of one 3-year volunteer than it did out of 4 2-year draftees. Beyond that, this effort to train hundreds of thousands of incoming soldiers stripped the Army of much of its ability to train for atomic war. So the obvious solution is to transition from a draftee force to a professional force of lifetime soldiers. But the flip side of that is, in order to get those volunteers, it had to promise occupational training. And that occupational training, in turn, made these people very attractive to the civilian market. So in practice, technical positions went to volunteers, combat positions went to the draftees. People think that happened in Vietnam. In fact, it starts emerging in the 1950s very, very easily. And so in fact, the combat forces tend to be filled up with short service draftees, while the volunteers go in the rear echelon. Now, if the Army has to replace 30%, given the 3-year enlistment, of its skilled workforce, then it probably needs, every year, then it needs probably about 30% of that 30% to re-enlist. But as we can see, that didn't happen. Or at least it did happen, in the sense that career soldiers re-enlisted at phenomenally high levels. But the average was below that 30%. And it's made up, again, of these career soldiers and people in jobs or MOSs that the draftees could do. Cooks, drivers, security guards, and so forth. That Nike technician that we saw in that recruiting force doesn't re-enlist, okay? I mean, electronics never came close to the 30% that the Army needed. In fact, at its peak, it was half that. The draftees couldn't be persuaded to re-enlist under any circumstances. That 20% is an aberration that comes from the Army claiming the draftees who were in basic training, who signed up for another year to avoid the infantry, were re-enlisting. They weren't. And once Congress caught them doing that, you can see draftee re-enlistments drop considerably. Next slide, please. This slide, I think, is pretty significant, and the implications are pretty bad. Army officers tended to blame the lack of re-enlistment on softness, on American culture, on civilianism, even communism. But the sad truth is that the people who experienced the Army, when they were asked why they didn't re-enlist, they didn't cite the things that you would expect: food, physical hardship, pay, bad working conditions. The dominant was leadership. And this may not be a problem in today's Army, but it's certainly one that affected the past force. And it suggests that incentivizing through higher pay, civilianizing facilities, better gyms, Starbucks, and so forth, may not be the answer. That in fact, as Army Vision 2018 does state, a key factor is going to be personnel. Last slide, please. So I would emphasize this as a sort of takeaways for people looking at how this could help today's Army. One of them is, and I think the 50s demonstrate this, is that doctrine, equipment, organization, they're all crucial. And they interact, and a failure in one can cause a failure in another. Certainly, Pentomic's problems were caused in part by its equipment failures. Certainly, the problem with exercising atomic doctrine failed because the organizations and the equipment were unable to exercise it. But a crucial point that's often overlooked is personnel. And there's sort of an assumption that if you build it, they will come, that the personnel will be there. And in fact, one of the things that's really worth studying the 1950s for is to learn what are the problems with enlisting and retaining skilled personnel. A second aspect is that we often ignore implementation. People are enamored with concepts. They're enamored with equipment. They're enamored with organization. You've all seen those wire diagrams. But there are very few in-depth studies of how transformation is implemented in the field and what its effects are. And I think the Atomic Army is perhaps the best case we have for what is the effect in the field of trying to do these radical changes. And last, transformation is a very broad process. We tend to think of it in equipment, doctrine, and organization, and some people will throw in personnel. But all those by themselves require a host of changes, require whether education or training or maintenance or the development of quality. Those are just some of the ones. And each one of those then has things that have to be changed. And we don't know the consequences of them. We don't know the consequences of the decisions we make today until 5 or 10 years into the future. And thus, I would argue, history is very important, because history may not provide solutions for today, but it can provide context. It can teach us that if we go down this road, these are the possible consequences. And that, I would argue, is going to be essential, that sort of perception of what are the possible consequences if the Army does transform, as Army Vision 2018 says, to multi-domain operations in 2028. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to take questions now.
Okay, Brian, we have a couple of questions already. The first question from Jeff is actually 3 questions in one. Would you agree?
I remember that, Jeff.
Would you agree that the oft-stated belief that the Army was motivated by budgetary considerations as it was being squeezed out by the Air Force and Navy during this period of the 1950s?
Yeah, I don't accept that anymore. I think it's a sort of cheap solution. I've heard that from the beginning. In fact, I was taken to task by a senior colonel who argues, well, it's all budgets. But you know, the problem with the budgetary argument is they make the claim, but you have to find the smoking gun. And it's very hard to establish that in the documents. What you can find, and I've never found a reason to sort of dismiss documents as lie. What you can find is a lot of discussion about tactics and a lot of discussion about public relations and a lot of discussion about all these other things I've talked about today. The budget, yes, but the budget is seen as a way of creating this Army, not simply, you know, this sort of cynical effort to manipulate Congress and the president to get more. If someone wants to find the smoking gun with Ridgway or Taylor, you know, rubbing their hands, they're fine. I'll believe it. But, you know, I haven't seen it in, 20 years of researching this topic.
Second part of the question is the doctrine is based upon a premise that political authority will authorize widespread use and discretion by military commanders of use of these weapons. However, did you see that actually occur in doctrine or in anything on the political side, giving commanders that authority?
Yeah, I mean, this is Jeff was always really great when I was there and still is about pointing out this divide between civil and military. And I think one of the things that's fascinating about this, and I didn't want to go into it in too much detail, is essentially that the Army is violating national policy. You know, the Army is essentially saying, yes, Eisenhower, you claim you're going to massively retaliate, and the Russians have to believe you for massive retaliation to work. But at the same time, we're undermining you by claiming you're not going to do that. and you're going to have to fight this war. So there's a huge civil-military divide here, with the Army pursuing, in many ways, its own policy in sort of defiance of national security policy. I think this is another thing. I didn't want to go into it in too much detail in this talk because I wanted to focus on tactics and organization and doctrine and equipment. But you're right, absolutely right, Jeff. This is another great reason to study the atomic army, is to see what happens when a service decides it's going to pursue its own vision of war.
A third part of that question is, did you see any discussion, at least on Army leaders, about creating custodial units to allow our allies, Germans, Turks, Greeks, to support our efforts during time of war?
Yeah, there actually, I don't know if you know this, there's a proposal to create an American Foreign Legion with all these displaced Eastern Europeans and refugees from communist tyranny. It didn't go. No, because I think when you start doing that, you start striking at the results of the 1947 Officer Personnel Act, which is to create this very top-heavy officer corps, especially at the field ranks, and those people need things to do. So if you create custodial units, then you're sort of undermining the Army's claim to be able to mobilize. Remember, one of the reasons for the draft was to create a mobilizable force, that Marshall and Eisenhower both supported universal military training as a mobilizable force. They wanted a reserve in the millions to fight atomic war, so that creating these custodial units was really in variance with that objective.
Next question's from David. He wants to ask if you did any exploration of the Navy's attitudes towards tactical nukes and nuclear warfare.
Not original research. I'll tell you that the 50s are really not well explored. And so when you get into the archives, you'll find that there's so much stuff. I mean, I think it would be great because the Navy does have to evolve from having very limited atomic capacity to with Polaris and the submarine force being, in fact, one of the key elements of the triad. So I'll be interested in that, in looking at that. I mean, another study to be done is the Marine Corps, which, if you think about amphibious warfare, that's one of the first things that Gavin identifies as no longer possible in the atomic age. How did the Marine Corps react to that? It's a good question, but I think if you get into it, you're going to find, this will take up a long time just to do one service.
This is from Michael. Were you able to drill down through the 55% leadership reason for non-reenlistment?
Yeah. Yeah. And I would also point out that in part, it's the non-commissioned officers corps. That a real, in a world, and Charles Mosk has pointed this out, and I think he's correct. In World War II, the antagonism is the caste system between enlisted and officer. In the 50s Army, it's increasingly, it's not throughout the Army, but there's real antagonism between the enlisted men, particularly the better educated enlisted men that the Army wants to keep, and the NCO Corps. In 1956 or 57, I believe, the Army did tests, and they found out that a quarter of their NCO force was Category 4, meaning it was functionally illiterate. And, we still have that stereotype with Sergeant Snorkel and Beetle Bailey. And so that was, I think, the primary reason, is these sort of brutal, uneducated, and very defensive NCOs and young high school graduates and college students. But you also have to remember that a lot of the junior officer corps didn't stay in. And they were ROTC students, and they were complained about micromanagement, what was called snoopervision, and being unable to do what the Army promised them, to lead troops in combat, or lead troops lead troops on exercises and so forth. And they blamed the field officers. So I think there's multiple reasons for this. And among enlisted, it tends to be the enlisted versus NCOs. Among junior officers, I'd say junior officers versus field officers.
Last question, I think, is from Robert. It ties to the development of this doctrine in a sense to respond to Soviet aggression in Europe. But did you ever find within your studies serious contemplation by the Russians of coming across the border?
Well, I think that's a really good question. It leads to the difference between facts and interpretation. And as you know, even nowadays, 50% of Americans can see one set of facts and draw a completely different interpretation. I mean, that was just in the newspaper today. People point out there's that you can give people the same facts and they're going to interpret them totally differently. And we're seeing that right now. Certainly, there was nothing in the Russian behavior in 45, 46, and 47 that would lead Army officers to dismiss the fact or to dismiss the possibility of a Soviet invasion. There was very little in their rhetoric that would lead them to dismiss that. So these people had, the Army leadership sort of takes the Soviet leadership at its word, that this is, the revolutionary proletariat, that they're going to liberate, that the capitalists have become the fascists. They had seen in Korea a Soviet surrogate, and correctly or not, none of them believed that North Korea wouldn't have invaded without Soviet support. So throughout their experience, the Soviets had been aggressive. And I think they drew perhaps an appropriate conclusion from that.
Ryan, thanks for conducting today's lecture. I keep